Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to make some coasters that stick together. Pretty much any wood will work for this, but I had a piece of red oak. It was a piece of barn wood that I had from a previous project, so I ripped it down to a 5-inch strip. I set up a 5-inch stop block on my sled, and then cut it down into 7 5-inch squares. This wood is 1 inch thick, which is thicker than I need, but I'm going to end up cutting them in half. Figuring out how to make a hexagon in a square is actually not that hard. I started by making cross lines to find the center of the square and then used a compass to draw a circle that went all the way to the edges. I drew a center line and found the middle of the square, and I used the ends of that with the compass at the same settings to make intersection marks with the circle. Doing it this way, you have 6 points that are equidistant, and then you can use a straight edge to draw lines in between those points. And there is your hexagon. I followed the same process for the other 6 squares. If you can take your time at this point and try to be really precise, you'll end up with much more uniform shapes later on in the project. The first step in cutting these is to rip off the 2 edges with extra material, and you can see that here. Then you use a miter sled, set it to 30 degrees, and put the piece on to line up the lines that you've drawn with the blade. You do 1 rotation to get the next cut. This is a place where you also need to take your time to make sure that you're cutting right along the lines so that all the sides are the same length. Now once I had these cut, I found the center of each piece and drew a line on 3 sides. This gives me a guideline that I can use on the bandsaw to cut these in half. Doing it this way, you actually get 2 coasters for the price of 1. So after I did a bunch of these, I needed to make a jig to hold it in place so I could drill a hole. I traced it onto a scrap piece of plywood and then cut that out on the bandsaw. And here's one more place where the more precise you can be, the better results you're going to get, especially on the inside of this cut. You want to try to follow those lines as closely as possible. Mine wasn't perfect, and the end result turned out just fine, but the more precise you can be, the better result you'll get. I test fit a couple of the pieces in place just to make sure that they fit right. I measured the center of the inside of my shape and marked it with a punch. I used this as a pilot hole to drill a hole with a 3/8 inch bit all the way through. I ran the bit through so it barely stuck out the other side of the wood and marked that position with some tape. I clamped the jig down to the table, and then I could drill through the pilot hole into each side of the coasters. The tape told me where to stop so that the holes were very shallow. Then I just drilled those holes on every side of every coaster. I found some packs of rare earth magnets, which are really strong magnets, at Harbor Freight, and you get 10 for about $3. They're pretty inexpensive. I put in a small drop of glue and then pushed in a magnet flush with the surface into each hole. As I moved on to the next hole, I flipped over the stack of magnets so that every other magnet on the perimeter of each coaster had opposite polarity. Without really thinking about it, I grabbed Gorilla Glue to use for this, which works fine, but it expands as it dries. So when it was dry, I had stuff I had to scrape off and cut off and sand off to get it clean. So if you make these, you might want to use CA glue or some sort of epoxy that's not going to expand. I sanded down and cleaned up all the edges of each coaster. Then I wanted to test on the magnets. You can see that the opposite polarity works as you spin them around. You just have to get them lined up correctly, and then every other side will stick together. Before applying the finish to these, I rounded over the edges of the top and the bottom and smoothed out the surfaces on all of the coasters. When they were all done, I put several coats of spray lacquer on both the top and the bottom. Now I've got a set of coasters that snap together just by getting them close to each other. You can pull one off, use it as a coaster, and when you're finished with it, put it back in the group. You can flip them over to have dark or light. You can change the pattern and the shape of the overall thing. In fact, you could use this as a trivet for something hot and then pull it apart to have individual coasters if you needed them. It's almost like a useful puzzle that you can have on your tabletop. So of course I could have cut these on the CNC machine. They would have been perfectly accurate and it would have been really easy, but it also would not have made a very interesting video. I wanted to find out what it would take to cut a hexagon with a table saw. That's a tool that a lot of people have access to, and it turned out not to be that hard. Now the difficulty could be in making them really precise, making a bunch of them to have the exact same precision. And that's really just about taking your time when you're drawing and making sure that the lines are exactly right and the angles are exactly right. Not impossible, it's just a time thing. Overall, the magnets worked really well. well for this. I think the jig helped a lot in getting them aligned, but there again, it could have been a little bit more precise and they would have lined up a little bit better. Now since I didn't plane down both sides of the board, they're not all the same thickness and they're not all perfectly flat on one side, and that's okay. I mean, they're coasters, they don't have to be. But because of that, that made so the magnets don't line up perfectly on a vertical space. They are really close, and they're close enough to where you can't tell, and it works fine on a table. Those are the types of things that if you want these to be really finished looking, really precise, then you'll need to make sure that the wood is the same thickness on every piece, and then the jig will help get the magnets in the exact same centered location vertically. Visually, you could do lots of different things to these to make them look however you wanted. You could have them really finished, really rustic. You could paint them, you could stripe them, you could engrave things on them with the CNC or with a Dremel tool or whatever you want. There's tons you could do to customize these, especially if you're planning on selling them or giving them away as gifts. If you wanted to hide the magnets on the outside, you could either paint the outer edge, and that might be interesting, or you could use an iron-on veneer on the outside, and that would make it look like these were solid wood and you didn't have the magnet in there, but the veneers would be thin enough that the magnets would still work really well. So even though the end product looks really simple, it was an interesting challenge to try to get the shape cut, try to get the jig built, and I hope that you found something interesting in this project to help you with something that you're gonna make. I hope you liked this one, and if you did, I'd love to hear about it. I also love to see the stuff that you are working on. You can post that on my Facebook page, tag me on Instagram or Twitter. I love to see that stuff, so please continue to do that. I've got a lot of other projects and playlists, all sorts of stuff that you might enjoy. I've also got a podcast that I do with Jimmy DiResta and David Picciuto called Making It. I'll put a link to that down in the description if you want to check that out. That comes out every Friday. If you want to help support these videos, Patreon is the best way to do that. There's some exclusive content that the Patreon creators get and a bunch of other stuff, so be sure to go check that out. That's it for this one, guys. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time. Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff. Today we're going to make some coasters that stick together. What? If you get them turned the right way, they stick together. Today we're going to make some coasters. Hey, I'm Bob at ILikeToMakeStuff.